Welcome to the Out of This World show. 7 ways crimes were investigated and solved in ancient Egypt. Number 7. Trained monkeys would attack thieves. Sometimes a crime would be stopped before it was even committed. Because the majority of the ancient police force in Egypt were posted as guards around the cities, and keeping an eye on the tombs and the marketplaces to make sure nobody would get out of line. Also, it was a pretty good deterrent, but some thieves tried anyway. But, if you got caught breaking the law in ancient Egypt, thieves might just end the day with an attacking monkey on your face, leg, or back. And the guards in ancient Egypt would often have trained animals with them. Most of the time, they were Egyptian dogs. But more than a few walked around with monkeys on leashes, trained and ready to attack. And there is even a picture of them in action on one of the servants' tombs. That clearly shows a thief at a market trying to make his getaway, but only to have an attacking monkey on a leash grab his leg, and then start pulling him down to the ground and holding him in place until guards arrive to help. Number 6. Snitching was mandatory by law. When the ancient Egyptian detectives were called in, their jobs weren't too easy. They had to track down some criminals without a good witness. But the Egyptian courts made sure that they had a witness by laying out serious penalties for failing to report any crime that was done. Even when Ramses III was assassinated, the guards didn't just round up all the people that were responsible. They also rounded up all their butlers and servants as well. So they would have plenty of chances to overhear the conspiracy. Sometimes the courts ruled that their failure to report it made them a criminal, and as a punishment, all their ears were cut off, since so as far as the courts were concerned, they weren't making any good use of them, anyway. But you didn't have to overlook a plot or crime or overthrow the king to get in big trouble. But a failure to report a crime carried a lot of heavy consequences, and that was a serious motivation to talk. So one man's story in ancient Egypt was that after hearing his boss conspiring to rob a tomb of a pharaoh, he immediately sent a letter ratting him out to the authorities. And in his letter, he made it clear that it was fear of punishment that motivated him. The letter said this: "I had to report this crime to my lord. For it was a crime for one like me to hear such words and conceal them." Number 5. Suspects and witnesses were beaten until they talked. So when it came time to get answers in the ancient world, some of the detectives didn't exactly play the nice guy. They just would have guards beat people senseless until they confessed. Also, they were very clever about using torture on people. And in all the court records we have recovered, they would very casually talk about their methods. All the examinations were held by beating a person with a double rod. Typically, they would tie up the person to a stake and beat his hands and feet until he gave up the answers they wanted. Number 4. Confessions were compared to the evidence. They also did realize that beating prisoners could lead to some false confessions. So that's why the investigators spent so much time investigating crime scenes. And they wanted to make sure all these people weren't just making up stories, or just saying anything they wanted them to hear. So all the criminals' testimonies would be later compared to what they'd found at the crime scenes. And if a gang had worked together as a team to do the crime, they all would be separated before they were tortured to make sure all their stories were the same. Number 3. Witnesses had to describe how they would be mutilated if they lied. The consequences of lying were often worse than the consequences of the crime itself, because in some cases they would be warned that if the investigators were convinced that they had lied, their nose and ears would be cut off of their bodies. Also, they would be tortured by being stretched apart on the rack. Number 2. Ancient Egypt had crime scene investigators. Most citizens in ancient Egypt would get in line outside the court to complain about their neighbors. So if it was a serious enough crime, an investigator would be sent out on the job from the court. Also, these investigations were surprisingly good, because they didn't just draw straws or go off a hunch, they would round up all the suspects, then start questioning witnesses, investigate the crime scene, and even arrange a reenactment to test theories about the crime. And they even had ancient detailed records of past accusations of crimes so they could check and monitor people's criminal histories. Number 1. Even if you were innocent, you were labeled a criminal, and infidelity could be punishable by death. In ancient Egyptian court, the record describes a man named Amenkau, who was repeatedly beaten by the pharaoh's guards after his capture. And no matter how hard they hit him, he would keep insisting that he hadn't seen anything, saying, "Whatever I've seen you have heard from my mouth already." So no amount of torture would loosen his tongue, so they decided he was probably telling the truth, and then they let him go. But he wasn't totally free of a disciple after being freed though. Because even after he was found innocent, the accusation was permanently kept in the Egyptian record books, with the words "great criminal" next to his name. But divorce court was so brutal in ancient Egypt because anyone could take anyone else to court for having an affair. So unlike most of the neighbors, this wasn't a right reserved for men but for women, because they let women sue their husbands for infidelity and divorce. But they even let people sue random neighbors in their town who they thought were cheating on their wives. So the punishment was so severe: if a woman was found guilty of cheating on her husband, she could have her nose cut off. Or, in some cases, could even get burned alive. But men, it seems, never got the death penalty for infidelity. But breaking a marriage bond could still get him 1,000 whip blows and a writ of divorce. Thank you for watching. Now please like, subscribe and share for more of the Out of This World show.